All right, folks, off the top of my head, this is the only in-state rivalry that has produced a national championship game. If we think back to 1996, we got Florida State rivalry talk. It's rivalry month here at Mark Rogers TV. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel as we team up with SG1 Sports for the very best in college football coverage. Of course, subscribe, like, and comment. Do the gamut all the way through. And if you like the audio, go to Google Play, Podbean, iTunes, or Stitcher for Mark Rogers TV. Got David Waters from Gators Breakdown. We got James Coleman from Gridiron Now. He's also live at the Sports Den as well. Catch his podcast right there as well. It's just Big Game James 36. Catch him on Twitter or Gators Breakdown. Gator Dave SEC for David. So, guys, we appreciate you jumping on board. And this is what I would consider to be with James. A couple weeks ago, we talked Clemson and Florida State. That would be the microwave rivalry of like the last 5 years. It didn't exist before that. But talking about like a new rivalry, but that's been established here for 30 years or so in terms of the national consciousness. And arguably, guys, in the 90s, this might have been the best rivalry in college football when you talk about just sheer results equaling major wins and competing for national championships. What do you think, James?
I mean, I think it's been great. When you think about what happened with Florida State, obviously they brought on Coach Bowden, late 70s, really came into prominence in the early 80s. And then really Florida flourished under Steve Spurrier in the 90s. And you see both these dynamic coaches, Hall of Fame type coaches, great personalities, recruiting different levels, different types of players, but having the similar results led to some really epic battles. You obviously talked about 96. 96 led to where we had the big time comeback, and then Florida then played Florida in the bowl game. Some great fights on the field. So I mean, it's one of the better rivalries in sports. It's actually when we talked about Clemson, I mean, they're kind of a rival. Miami is a rivalry. I don't mind. I almost went to Miami. I just don't like Florida. I mean, I have no problem with Dave, but I don't like Florida though.
So, James, you said one thing real quick, and before we hit Dave, that I want to get clarified here. Different types of recruiting. Can you explain that?
And it's not to say that Florida doesn't do this. I think the best way for me, being a non-Florida fan, obviously, and I was a transplant to Florida. So, most of my family is in the New Jersey area. So, but I grew up in Tallahassee. So, we didn't know much about it. But when we saw, and I'm an inner city kid. So, when I watched Florida State, I watched Miami. I see the gold teeth, Jerry curls, big hair, backflips, dance, what some people would consider undisciplined type of play, but what guys like me growing up would consider fun. And then you see Florida, I mean, just with different players that were a little bit more buttoned up, little different culture. Nothing wrong with it. I think the best way to think about it is what Jalen Rose described, the Duke versus Michigan type of rivalry. And again, some of that was just Jalen Rose just doesn't like Duke. And it just doesn't mean it was the truth. It just means that was his perception. And we looked at them as, a little more country club guys, and we looked at ourselves a little bit more rough around the edges.
That's an interesting take because the rest of us don't see that. When we look at Duke and Michigan on the basketball floor back in the early 90s, that one's obvious to see. But Florida State, I never really got that take. That's an interesting one. David, when you look at FSU, Florida, obviously two big rivals for you out of the SEC Eastern Division, but this is one at the end of the season. National perspective, out of conference. What makes this one different?
James pretty much said it. Bowden was there at FSU, and it didn't really pick up the national prominence until Spurrier got to Florida, and there was the jabs back and forth at each other. And lo and behold, also just great games that led to, it was the last game of the season. A lot of national championship hopes were on the line, and when these two teams matched, and not only that, it was a bloodbath. James mentioned the pregame fights and the antics going on there, and Spurrier running at the mouth and all that stuff. And Florida was confident going into a lot of those games and had their either came out on top and went on to play in an SEC championship game. and then, you know, a big bowl game or whatever, but it was all set up by that Florida State game at the end of the season. And, you know, James mentioned recruits as well. You know, just recent history, Dalvin Cook was a big time Florida State battle. Dante Fowler, Matt Elam, both of those guys ended up going to Florida through FSU. Dalvin Cook to FSU after being committed to Florida. You know, yeah, you would think you would see a lot more of those type of recruitments and a lot more of sharing of recruits. But James is kind of right. There is a different style of player that goes to either school. You know, maybe not so much now as the way it used to be. But you know, those recent recruiting battles also stick to it, because how different will Muschamp's career have been if he landed Dalvin Cook, and yeah, how if Dante Fowler and Matt Elam would have stayed with FSU, that Florida defenses that were so great under Muschamp may not have been that way there. It may not have been as good. So, you know, those fortunes of those recruits going there, you know, really kind of just speaks to how close this rivalry is.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, breaking down one of the best in the rivalry department here in Rivalry Month, Florida State. All right, James, as I like to mention every time James is on, we got a unique perspective in terms of fan before he hit the field for Florida State, player, which is the big distinction, and then media analyst and writer here. So for your years in Tallahassee, James, you got the better of the Gators the first 2 years, 31-14 and 38-34 in a barn burner. Then Florida comes back with wins 20-13 and 34-7 in 05. What do you remember about those games?
Yeah, that 05 game got out of hand real quick. Yeah, it was we were there. What I really remember was we kind of imploded in 05. You know, we had just gotten over the Miami hump, and then we hit some adversity, young quarterbacks, some injuries. But I remember them blocking a field goal, and I want to say we would have – if the game would have been 10-3 at that point, and they blocked it, and they went on to score. And so 17-0, and then after that, you know, Urban went on ahead and put the foot on the grass, which I respect. I like that. If you can, there's no need to just beat somebody kind of when you can blow them out. 04, we had just lost a tough game to Maryland, and our national championship implications were done. So, like, if we make a field goal against Maryland, we probably go into that game. That was when Bobby Bowden field was dedicated. The game that sticks out the most, I mean, 02 is like I played significant minutes in the fourth quarter, and I got some of my first tomahawks on my helmet from that game.
Nice.
Bowl game. But 03, I played with a broken hand and a torn labrum, like we were talking about, like that. So I knew I was going to have surgery in the offseason and on the shoulder, but I knew, like, as soon as that game was over, that we had a scheduled surgery on my hand for that. But that was the game when we had a big fight. Florida was doing well. We came back, and PK Sound caught the ball in the end zone, and the dog almost bit him. I do remember those things. And I remember thinking in my head, man, this reminds me of the games that I watched when I was younger. The only thing that could possibly, and I said this, and you can, if you ever get a chance to hit up Chris Ricks on Twitter, I think I said it to Chris. I said, the only thing that can make this game better is a fight. And I said that as a player, but from a fan perspective, the only thing that can make this better would be a fight. And it was a fight. And I get a chance to see Theatric Faison a little bit in the Jacksonville area. And, you know, he had the throat slashing thing. And it's just one of those things like, hey, man, the game ain't over until – in these games, the game ain't over until this 3-0's up on that clock.
Hey, Dave, we've talked a lot of college football, and we had you on with Mike LaValle a couple of weeks ago for Florida, Tennessee. And if I remember right, you really got into that matchup and got into college football like early to mid-90s and really locked in. My thoughts, when I think Florida State, first thing in my mind is when I think rivalries, it's Ohio State, Michigan, it's Alabama, Auburn. I think those are the two gold standards for the ages, and kind of a north-south, depending on where you are. Those are the big national games, and then those are the rivalries that go way, way back. But when Florida State started to hit prominence, there was like Alabama, Auburn weren't really nationally significant. Ohio State, Michigan, more of a plotting style. The programs were still in good shape, but more of a plotting style. And this was the game, and because it was played the same weekend, it was really started to take center stage for those people that were really NFL minded and speed minded, that wow, now there's just craziness of talent and athletes and freakish athleticism on the field on this weekend. And if you want to see those guys, you watch Florida State.
Yeah, with the reputation Florida, recruits have are speed and power, and that's exactly what you got from these two teams in the '90s. Not only were they high flying offenses, they had smash mouth defenses to go along with them, and that's why they were so good. And you go to the mid '90s, and I think the first point I think that just really stuck it or Spurrier was up so big going into the fourth quarter in 94, 31-3, I believe. And Florida State storms back in the fourth quarter, and it ends up in a tie, and they go on to play in the Sugar Bowl as well. And Florida State kind of wins that game in the Sugar Bowl. I guess you could say it was just a continuation of the 31-31 tie. But that was a heartbreaker for Spurrier because he never beat FSU in Tallahassee. It was up 31-3 going into the fourth quarter, and let that game get away from him. Florida goes on to win in 95 to finish an undefeated regular season. They did go on to get smashed by Nebraska, but that finished Florida's first perfect season. But then 96 comes around where FSU beats Florida, and all the hits to echo to the whistle there, and Florida gets revenge in the national championship game. And it's just that little 94, 95, 96, and then 97 where Florida didn't have a lot to play for as far as the national championship goes. FSU had everything to play for, and it was one of the biggest upsets in the swamp. And a lot of people call it the loudest moment in the swamp when Doug Johnson finds Jaquez Green down the sideline for a 60-something yard gain, and Fred Taylor puts it in the end zone 2 plays later, a 3-play drive that late in the game that sets up Florida to win that game and dash FSU's hopes there for a national championship. So it was those mid-90s games where teams cost each other chances at national championships and bowl game matchups and matching up, as you said earlier, for the national championship. Is those mid-90s games just there was so much on the line for both teams where you couldn't help but see that game no matter what other game was on TV. Ohio State, Michigan had the reputation for being the game, but you couldn't miss Florida State because of what was at stake every time they played in the mid-90s.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, and I started out the segment making reference to that rematch at the Sugar Bowl for the national championship, in which, if I remember correctly, Danny Werfel really got beat up in that regular season final. The Florida State pass rush was all over him, sacked him like 7 or 8 times, and the Noles won that game. And then they rematch at the Sugar Bowl. But you mentioned, I'd forgotten about the scenario that just 2 years earlier. So that's crazy. Teams rematching the final game of the season, then in a major bowl game. And in that day, you basically had 4 major bowl games, and it all depended on the polls as to which was the best game and which was going to be determining the national championship. But yeah, that 31-all tie coming all the way back from 31-3 as the Gators blew the big lead. James, you got 5 straight for the Noles. You're down 34-26 overall, but where does this series stand right now? Both schools obviously a little bit down, but it looks like good times are ahead for each one.
I mean, I don't really look at people like to troll, man. We look at the overall score, the overall series, but I'm like, I'm born in 1984, bro.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't really care about all that stuff, but and then right now it's fun to troll, win 5 in a row, but it's only fun when you're like at least playing for conference or you're playing for something. So both programs were down. I think. Man, Florida's hard. Steve Spurrier said some things right before he left, and I got a chance to be really within the Coach McElwain firing, and we got a chance to break some news with a guy Darren Heitner and some other stuff. But like Steve Spurrier said, that Florida's a job that can chew you up and spit you out, and I never really thought about it because all I knew for the most part was Spurrier. But when you look at it, Spurrier was there for just over a decade. Matter of fact, Spurrier did not recruit me coming out of high school. It was Ron Zook that recruited me. And I remember him calling my mom, and I told him, with all due respect, sir, there's not a need for you to even come on my campus because there's hell I'm going to Florida. It's either FSU or Miami at the time. More so, actually, believe it or not, more so Miami at the time. But what I've seen them do since then, and obviously with Meyer, whatever you believe with the heart stuff, but you've seen Muschamp do things, and he just missed on a quarterback, and which has kind of gone into the McElwain, has gone into Mullen. If Mullen can find somebody that can be a capable quarterback, then you can see Florida actually have some more exciting times. But unfortunately, the way the game goes, if you don't have anything, then it's just difficult to play it at a high level. But some of that talent they got, I think the Ole Miss transfer, the Ohio State transfer at wide receiver, make their wide receiver core pretty exciting. I can't actually wait to see two unproven but very talented, in a wide receiver core from UF and a secondary at FSU, see these guys go back and forth. And it will remind me of, and then these D lines can remind me of some ones in the past. You've got guys like CeCe Jefferson, who, if healthy, can be a bigger version of a freak from UF. And you've got Brian Burns, who has all the makings to be a Peter Boulware type defensive end. And, like I said, there's a lot of excitement going on. Two coaches that can recruit. And it's a lot of smack talking. So both sides, as I call it, Big Three Twitter, has been really on point, popping. I can't pulling for everything right now.
The chat here is having some fun with you guys, mostly Georgia and Miami fans, as you guys can imagine. But until somebody says something truly clever or unique, we won't pay it any mind at this point. But you guys can at least share a hatred for Miami, and that's something that FSU has to deal with every year. For you guys, David, a game in Orlando next year.
Yeah, and a lot of people wish these teams played more, and I do too. But it's not ideal for Florida to play FSU and Miami every year, along with what they already have to play in the SEC. It doesn't happen. No program is going to schedule two out-of-conference permanent opponents like that. So, believe me, I wish they played. Mark, you and I have talked before. I hate cupcake games. I can't stand them. But to I guess sacrifice moving Georgia out of Jacksonville, which I don't want to happen. You probably would have to do that if you played Miami every year. So I would like a tougher schedule. Don't mind if they would play Miami, twice out of every 4 years or twice out of every 6 years, something like that to keep the rivalry going and these teams can play more. But it makes no sense to have FSU and Miami on the schedule every year, but also what you have to do in conference there. So, but still, get rid of the cupcake games, go play in Michigan like you did last year, or maybe schedule a UCLA, USC, Ohio State, Texas, something like that to change the schedule up. But I don't. It's not going to happen where you play Florida State and Miami every year. But yeah, talking just about the recent history of the game, as you just brought up, Florida only won once out of the last 8 years, and that was the 2012 Will Muschamp over Jimbo Fisher, where Florida, it was just an upset away from later that night of USC beating Notre Dame, and they have a chance to maybe go to the chance to maybe play Alabama in the national championship game that year, even though they go into the Sugar Bowl and get destroyed by Louisville. But it was just the last time Florida beat FSU. That's how close it was for Florida to be in the national championship discussion. So, the recent history, two brand new head coaches, they're going to establish their roots here. Taggart's already got a reputation for being able to recruit the state of Florida from this time at USF and his history even before that, being down there from that Tampa area. And, Mullen with his history back under Urban Meyer, can he get these roots with these recruits, these state of Florida recruits? Can he just start, getting his relationships built there? And I think James was right. These guys can recruit well. It won't take Taggart as much time to recruit, I don't think, just because those relationships are a little built now. Mullen, it might take him a year or two to get those relationships built even more. So I do expect, these two coaches to be at these programs for years to come.
So, James, while David brings it up, would love to get your perspective on scheduling from a player's perspective, because we love to see the big games. But David makes the point right there. Florida State already match up. So you got 8 conference games, arguably the two best conferences in America, the ACC and the SEC. So you've got 8 rough games to deal with, basically. Then you've got a Florida State. And then for Florida State this year, they've got Notre Dame. For Florida last year, they scheduled a Michigan. So that takes 2 out of the 4 spots that are really difficult games. Then you've got 2 other games that could be a group of 5 or an FCS. Now, I would love to go to 9 conference games and then have 3 other non-conference games, obviously, and play 2 Power Fives, and then let the schools go out and schedule, let's say, an FCS. But I'm not playing the games and getting beat up every week. So your thoughts about that kind of scheduling quandary? We don't want these guys just dead at the end of the year, having played 12 difficult games, but at the same time, we don't love watching the Citadel out there trying to tackle Auburn or Alabama.
Yeah, well, I mean, you gotta be careful. Florida gotta watch these cupcakes. I've never seen an FBS get beat by a team that didn't complete a pass. So, I mean, with Georgia Southern when they were there, I mean, that was impressive. But it took. You gotta also remember, man, it took state law to get Florida State in Florida every year. Like it's illegal for Florida to not put us on the schedule. I guess you could say the inverse is true too, but like we kind of have to play that game. But the Miami game, I think it definitely would be great, especially with, they say they're back. I'll give them, they're better. I don't know, but, they're getting there. They're getting there. But it would be great to just see that even if it was home and home, even though Miami doesn't really have a home stadium, they borrow stadium. But for Florida, it would be good. It would, bring people into Gainesville. And I get what you're saying. Like you play in Michigan, you play some of these other schools, but there's really no need when you got a team down the street and, you played FAU. We're getting the Miami-ish teams. Just get the real Miami guys going in there. And it is cyclical. So, like, right now, it's easy to say, but in 2 to 3 years, it could be completely different. Like, perfect example, there's nothing terrifying about Vanderbilt. Never has been, never will be. Kentucky has I don't think I've been alive for a Kentucky victory over Florida. Tennessee will be better eventually. Obviously, what Kirby's done with Georgia. And I know you say you got some Georgia fans. Just understand they can talk trash. They're a whistleblower away. We know something's going on over there in Georgia. We just don't know how much money it is, but it's something. Like, you don't just do that. But the bottom line is some of the SEC East isn't as strong, and you don't play Alabama or Auburn this year. You play LSU. But, again, it's cyclical. Like, who knows? Again, Georgia's better. Tennessee could get hot. Kentucky has had its chances, but you never know. But I would like to see, just for the rivalries or for the state pride, which I have more than conference pride, is just to see there be a true – state champ, especially in a recruiting hotbed where if you look at the last rivals in 247 recruiting classes, 1 out of every 10 eligible high school athletes comes from out of the state of Florida. Like, it is a recruiting hotbed. Like, it's just good for those recruits to be able to go see quality games. I would like to see it, but personally, I don't really care. Like, as long as we beat Florida on Thanksgiving weekend and we get back to this Miami stuff, like I don't know what happened last year. We gotta get back to. I like it. At least if we can't win no championships, I want to at least beat my rival.
So James, you're saying this even though your division is a lot tougher than it used to be, with Louisville coming on, BC's not a joke, Wake's not a joke, Syracuse, but the division basically doesn't have any cream puffs like you used to count on with Wake, BC, and Syracuse.
I'll say this: they're very talented this year. Like, I'm not going to go out. Like, if these guys do what they're supposed to do, you won't see me going around beating my chest saying the ACC Atlantic is the toughest, is the greatest, one of the best divisions in football. No, it's just this year and probably the last year and the year after, like, we'll have a good 3-year stretch where there's some talented NFL-type players that will be there. With that being said, BC still has an uphill battle. They have to beat us in Doak. If I'm thinking correctly, North Carolina State's got a top 5 quarterback coming into college. I'm concerned, but all these teams were beatable last year if we had a coach who actually gave a damn about where he was at. He saw the money in the SEC, and I'm not mad at him, but he checked out. If you have a coach who's actually involved in the day-to-day, you may see some different things. But I won't pretend. I believe you said it right. I'll go top 3. I'm going to give the Big 12, the Big 10 its props right now in terms of how they're playing. The SEC and the ACC are definitely in there, but I don't see it as big of a grind as what people think because we're also used to that. So I think again, from how Florida State was established as the road warriors, we go and play the best wherever, whenever, however we can get it. So, like when you actually brought up some things about what made the rivalry in the '90s, Florida State going up and beating Ohio State or playing Ohio State, playing these guys on the road, and people are figuring out who the hell are these boys from Florida, and going into that final game with only one loss, that brought a lot more attraction to the rivalry. So somebody's got to go out here and beat these cats all over the nation, and we'll do it. Hopefully, we'll do it a little bit better than we did it last year.
Rivalry month on Mark Rogers TV. We're breaking down Florida State, probably the best rivalry of the '90s. I will throw Miami and Florida State in there as well, obviously. But that last weekend, that's rivalry weekend. So that's when I'm really thinking rivalries. So, David, we know that you only have a minute or two, but any games, players, off the field antics, anything that was said, anything that really punctuates this rivalry that conjures up good thoughts or maybe a little venom?
Of course, the best one that sticks out is just turning around and beating FSU for the national championship after getting stomped by them. On the defensive side, as you mentioned, Warfel getting pounded time and time again, but being able to beat him for that first national championship game. Spurrier to finally get his first, for the university to finally get their first, and it be against your biggest rival in a rematch. Yeah, that has to be number one. And then James can really speak to 2003. A lot of Gator fans, the Jeremy Foley, the at then time athletic director at Florida, after that game had to request, no longer can they have ACC officials inside the swamp because of questionable calls, questionable fumble calls, and all that. But hey, look, Florida still had a chance late in that game to make something happen, and Chris Ricks throws the bomb down the field for a touchdown, and FSU goes on to win. And a lot of the frustration, I guess you could say, from a lot of those calls is a lot of probably what helped lead Florida to wanting to get into a fight at FSU after the game and all that stuff. So that's the one that hurts the most, because it was so close and a lot of questionable calls, and it just didn't go Florida's way that night. But it was just that game just led to a lot of frustration for Gator fans, and it all just kind of culminated with that fight at the end of the game.
And the '97 game was a barn burner, if I recall correctly, back and forth like 32-29, something like that. That was a great game with Florida State, I believe, getting knocked out of a national championship appearance. James, I'll offer up the same question. David, you can hang on, but if you need to go, definitely take off as well. Whether you were on the field or not, what comes to mind? Great players, incidents, anything that hits you?
No, I just think the 2003 game, for so many reasons. I mean, we jumped on the logo. That's what we did back then. I don't know. We were young, we were wild, we were crazy, we were rapscallions. We beat people and we jumped on logos. That's what we did. But and seeing that, and again, I just remember knowing guys like Peter Boulware, who would talk to me about just in general, like if they were within 2 steps of the quarterback, they were going to hit the quarterback. Just period. Like they did all that work to get there. So you see rule changes come out of this rivalry. So a lot of the things that we did, like I said, jumping on the logos, like now they don't let you do that. It's frowned upon, which I think is kind of stupid. But it's
you can plant flags though.
That people legitimate, like it's stuff like I don't go to Gainesville. I will never go to Gainesville. I only watch this game live in Tallahassee. So and my son, who I love dearly, who has my name, can go to any school that he wants to go to when he is of age. He's only 5, but he can go to whatever school. I will not put the burden of him having to go to Florida State on him. But there is a school that he knows that if he does choose to go to, he will lose his entire inheritance. After 4 years, when he graduates, I will shake his hand as a man and say, I admire that you did all this by yourself with no family help. Call me when I have a grandson. That'll be my next conversation with him.
And Miami's not in that same declaration.
No, I almost went to Miami. I can't judge him for that.
Okay. Hey, James, I do have a question about that. Besides you though, like as FSU as a whole, what is the difference between a Florida versus Florida State and Florida versus Miami?
I think Florida State and Miami both came up the same way during the same time. Both of them rose during the 80s. I definitely say Miami was a better program in the 80s, not having the fear of playing anybody and you legit, and this is how I was able to say, Mark, what my feelings were. Like a lot of my friends, it came down like when we did our top 3 schools, it was a Miami hat or it was a Miami there. So like you saw these guys at camps, you saw these guys on official visits, and it was just a lot of stuff, like a lot of parallels there. With Florida, it was just, those guys didn't even think about coming to FSU. Maybe Florida, Miami, but it wasn't no Florida State thing. And then I'm also from Tallahassee, so it's a little bit different in the city of the 850 when it comes to that. We've had some guys go down there and do some great things at UF. There's a young man who was in the same recruiting cycle as me. I haven't talked to him since 2002, and Gavin Dickey, who signed to UF. That was a guy who was a UF FSU battle that we lost, but it's just kind of one of those rivalries that when you come in, the coaches just say that. And I think when I played, it had a lot more to do with Spurrier being there and being so dynamic. So like when you think about in the 90s, what happened with Schnellenberger was no longer there after he rose them up. Jimmy Johnson brings them up even higher. He's not there. They go get Dennis Erickson. They go on probate. You saw a lot of different coaches. Talent level still high in Miami, but there was no iconic coach that made people gravitate toward it. Steve Spurrier with the slamming of the visor, the trying to sweet talk refs and giving them penalties, and essentially calling my coach old and saying things like, ironically saying things like he can't see himself coaching to that age and then coaching to that age. But those are the things that I think the real reasons why. It's more so people just didn't like Spurrier, and that's kind of what clicked on it. But even through Zook and Meyer, who I believe if Meyer didn't leave, Florida would still have a real active, at least Big Two. Like Miami might still be where they're at, and hopefully Rick can get them to something. But I believe Meyer kind of maybe stunted the growth of the Florida coming back.
Well, that's one of those all-time what-if questions right there. If Urban Meyer would have stayed at Florida, considering what he's done the last 6 years at Ohio State, losing 8 games in 6 years, you got to think that he would have kept the train moving, and that would have been a whole lot of fun over the last 10 years in Gainesville. Dave, you can only
Mark, we ask ourselves the question: if that didn't happen to Meyer, and if Cam Newton didn't throw a laptop out of a window,
I mean, think about it. What he was doing. Is a laptop that bad?
Right, exactly.
Well, I take the laptop, man.
Yeah, I've had a few crash on me during these shows, and they're still intact. They're still okay. I guess when a few millions headed your way down the road, or maybe have already hit your back pocket, I'm not going to make a judgment on that, but I think we've got an idea. Then you make different choices in life.
Don't steal them and toss them out windows.
So, folks out there, if you love college football talk, it gets no better than right here. So if you're just joining us here in the last few minutes, what you do is you wait for the video to post just in the next couple minutes, and then you take in the whole Florida State talk. We had David on for Florida versus Tennessee. We've had James on for Florida State Clemson in the last 5-year rivalry right there in the ACC that's decided that conference just about each and every year. So, guys, I appreciate you jumping online. It's been a great talk. And James, you're coming on back tomorrow night. It's a Miami, Florida State talk.
All right, let's do it.
David, we appreciate it. James, we'll see you later.
All right.
See ya.